Every generation likes to think that it lives in uniquely challenging times. Nonetheless, things have happened in recent months which a short time ago would have seemed quite incredible. At 5 o'clock on Wednesday the 18th of March, after an emotional announcement from the librarian over the tannoy, the last readers left the UL and the bronze front doors were closed and locked. As Jess spoke, I thought of this photograph of the old university library being locked up for the last time in the summer of 1934. But that was planned. We were building a new library. March 2020 was quite different. I don't think I will ever forget the walk back through the empty reading room on my way to the back door. It was silent, but it wasn't the usual silence of calm, intense, shared scholarship. Within a matter of a few days, the great UL building almost entirely emptied of people. But I say almost advisedly. Now is the right moment, I think, to thank the small team of security and conservation staff who guarded the UL and its incomparable collections right through the lockdown. We owe them a lot. And in noting that, I think it's also right for me to pause for just a moment. In the next half an hour or so, I'm going to try standing back from recent events. But the COVID crisis has affected many people very profoundly, and I want to acknowledge that before I go on. Nothing quite like the recent lockdown has happened in Cambridge in centuries. We went on to restricted hours during the First World War, but the doors of the old university library remained open, even during the 1918 flu pandemic. The odd bomb fell on Cambridge in the Second World War, but unlike, say, the British Museum Library, the UL wasn't damaged, and it stayed open. The building even stayed open during air raids, though readers were expected to leave the reading rooms and work in the steel-framed stacks. And unlike our friends in some of the other national and legal deposit libraries, we didn't have to provide a shelter for other people's collections. The National Library of Wales partially closed from 1939 to 1945, providing a safe haven for books and manuscripts evacuated from London. But so far as I know, 2020 was the first time the library in Cambridge had closed entirely since the plague outbreak of the 1660s, when Newton went back to Woolsthorpe to sit under the apple tree. I realised that I just said closed, but of course the services of Cambridge University libraries didn't close. With astonishing resilience and agility, colleagues right the way across the piece went digital, supporting the work of a university which itself had gone online. I can't list everything that was going on, but among other things, online inquiries, a huge ebook programme, electronic reading lists, lots of social media, and dramatic progress on cataloguing backlogs in our historic collections. All this was carried out by staff working on sofas and sitting at kitchen tables. And even as we start to reopen physical premises, that is still going on. I cannot know this, but I strongly suspect that 2020 will turn out to be a significant turning point in the long history of libraries in Cambridge. Of course, we've had a substantial digital programme for many decades, and librarians across the world have been talking about a shift to digital for years. But it seems pretty clear that COVID-19 is going to accelerate something that was already well underway. I don't, of course, mean that physical books will cease to matter. The physical closure of libraries has demonstrated the sense of loss when the vast holdings of somewhere like the UL are inaccessible. And this isn't just a sentimental response, but a recognition of reality. I have no doubt that our cultural inheritance from the past will continue to matter. It certainly matters to me, whether that be the Newton manuscripts, or our Gutenberg Bible, or the million legal deposit books in the Tower. But I think that for many other everyday concerns, and for quite a lot of other purposes too, 2020 may well be remembered at the year when everything really started to change. If that's right, it certainly won't be the first change of its kind. The UL has repeatedly transformed itself over the last 600 years, and in the next half an hour or so, I want to ponder some of those periods of change. And since I've started in 2020, I'm going to explore that history backwards in 6 short excursions into the past. I want to start exactly a century ago. There was a great deal about Cambridge in 1920 that seems entirely familiar to us. Colleges, some old and new, tensions between town and gown, smart Victorian suburbs around Grange Road, a busy marketplace, King's Chapel, the Backs, regular trains to London, and also a definite sense of social inequality, just as today. And yet, as the curators of the recent exhibition, The Rising Tide, reminded us, there was also much about Cambridge a century ago which was very different indeed. This is all too easily masked by outwardly familiar places and structures. There was a lot about the university in 1920 which clearly harked back to the middle of the 19th century, or even earlier. It still returned 2 MPs to Parliament. It was relatively small. It was a private institution receiving little or no public money, with very obvious consequences for its social makeup. There were, I think, 16 colleges and far fewer people, a little bit less science, a lot less central administration, and a lot more religion, a hangover from Cambridge as the clerical seminary, which had been in part right into the 1870s. The sense that being an academic, or indeed a librarian, was in some way a recognisable profession was already on the way, but it hadn't completely got there. Despite the brilliant achievements of students from Girton and Newnham, women were systematically excluded from full membership of the university in 1920, and they've protested vigorously about it. After 1918, the university's stance on women was seen by many as not just indefensible, but ludicrous. The library had admitted its first woman reader probably in the middle of the 19th century, and its first student reader in 1871, but it took till the 20s for the syndicate to resolve that women should at last be admitted to the library on the same basis as men. The first woman on the staff, Alice Cook, arrived in 1903 to manage the arrival of Lord Acton's huge private library, the largest single library we've ever acquired. But the employment situation appears to have deteriorated in the interwar period. As an official memo put it, it was not the library's policy to employ ladies. The ruling body of the university in 1920 was still the Senate, which consisted of all Cambridge MAs. In the first place, again, that meant no women. In the second, it meant that crucial decisions about the future direction of the university could be voted on by a large and unpredictable electorate. What did this mean? Well, in practice, it meant that large numbers of men whose day-to-day involvement in the affairs of the university had ceased 30, 40, or even 50 years earlier could descend on Cambridge by train and vote on matters of fundamental importance to the university. This resulted in slow and cumbersome decision-making and an almost unlimited potential to block change if the change touched on anything that the MAs objected to. What does this have to do with the university library? I suggest rather a lot. If you read the pages of the University Reporter from the period, you'll find considerable discussion about the future of the library. It was, as it had been for over 500 years, located in the complex of buildings which today we usually call the old schools, right next to King's Chapel. The library had always been there, but like some gigantic cuckoo, over the centuries, it gradually took over the whole of the university's original medieval home. The buildings were progressively remodelled, rebuilt, and enlarged, eating up the neighbouring Old Court of Kings in the process. Looked at with an antiquarian eye, the old library was an extraordinary complex of historic buildings. But by 1920, it had already become dangerously dysfunctional and ramshackle. Fully 63 years after the building of the round reading room at the British Museum, the old library in Cambridge was still, in essence, a library without general reading rooms. What it did have was a rabbit warren of historic rooms and improvised storage, hopelessly and irredeemably full. It was clearly a fire risk, and its oddities made it very difficult to run. According to the long-serving university librarian, Francis Jenkinson, staff spent much of their time shuffling books around the building in a constant and failing battle to find more space. The response of members of the Senate to this was to squabble. Returning to the pages of the Reporter, it's possible to follow the twists and turns of the debate. I won't attempt to track them fully now, but by way of flavour, some favoured an underground bookstore, but others thought it would flood. There were proposals for an extension across the yard from the Senate House, but objectors complained it would block the view of King's Chapel, and anyway it would only buy time for a decade or two. There was a bit of discussion about an off-site store, but that was an unpopular option. It was thought it would be inconvenient. Proposals for a glass roof over an internal courtyard were widely denounced as architectural vandalism, and anyway, some suggested the roof would leak. Radical voices called for a new library, but others knew that this would be too expensive, and anyway, it was bound to be too far away, and it was surely inconceivable that the library should leave its historic home. But eventually we headed off in one of the most dramatic transformations in the UL's history. In 1920, the Senate decided, in principle, on a shift to a new building on the other side of the campus. Discussions on the details proceeded for the best part of another decade, but at the end of all of this, Cambridge had ended up with one of the most modern and radical library buildings anywhere in the world. Predictably, some people liked it, and some didn't. Quite a number of theologians and classicists and mathematicians were naturally confident that they knew more about window catches, heating plant, and bricks than the architect, Sir Giles Gilbert Scott. And of course, they lost no time in saying so. Again, you can read it all in the pages of the Reporter. If the Great Move had started as a bid for space, the fact that a decision was made and then successfully implemented is surely a pointer to something bigger. The debate over the new library was played out against a whole raft of changes in Cambridge. These included the Oxford and Cambridge Act of 1923, which stripped the Senate of its traditional powers, the progressive transformation of Cambridge into a publicly funded university, the creation of many new academic departments with new buildings, continuing debate about the role of women. The library itself saw substantial changes to the membership of the syndicate and major changes to its staffing. When A.F. Schofield arrived as university librarian in 1923, he started to create new specialist posts. New pension arrangements made it possible for long-serving staff to retire. Some of these staff were very long-serving indeed. One, a library assistant called A.S.B. Miller, had been on the payroll since 1868, an astonishing 55 years in post. Putting things in a nutshell, the UL was reshaping itself to service the needs of a university which was rapidly growing and modernising in the 1920s and early 1930s. Half the cost of the Scott building was covered by a now familiar and extremely welcome feature of the modern university, international philanthropy. And that is why the new library got its iconic tower. But our American donor didn't only pay for his cherished vertical landmark. John D. Rockefeller's benefaction covered not just a new library, but was part of a bigger package. It also included funding for a large array of new science labs. The donation in totality was intended to transform the work of the university right the way across the board. With the new library dealt with, I want to move back into the 19th century. Many of us will have read C.P. Snow's The Masters, set in 1937 in a thinly fictionalised Cambridge college which sounds remarkably like Christ's. You'll remember that Dr. Crawford, an FRS, eventually wins the disputed election to the mastership, but the voting is supervised by the elderly senior fellow, Professor Gay, a specialist in Icelandic sagas. Gay's grip on reality is a little tenuous, but he relishes all the attention, and particularly the opportunity to talk endlessly to younger colleagues about his saga men at high table. If we transport ourselves back to Gay's youth, then we are in the Cambridge of Henry Bradshaw, who was librarian here from 1867 to 1886. Bradshaw is a well-known figure in Cambridge, and his career probably doesn't merit a great deal of exploration today. It's difficult to know how to distill his multifarious interests into a couple of words, But if I were to attempt to do just that, my two words would be scholarship and stuff. Stuff is in principle simple: a dramatic expansion of collections, particularly manuscripts and early printing, backed by the syndicate. All of this was ultimately funded by the great wealth being generated in Victorian Britain as an industrial and frequently, let us be honest, predatory imperial power. A little later, the library started into other territory, including archives, ephemera, and the great collection of early Irish books which Bradshaw himself bequeathed to the university. This expansion continued under Bradshaw's successors, for example with the Cairo Geniza, which arrived in 1898, as well as books and manuscripts from India, China, and Tibet. These legacies of colonialism and empire now raise significant issues with which we, in common with many other collecting institutions, urgently need to engage. They mean that our collections are global in scale and scope. That presents opportunities for dialogue, for frank conversation, and for forms of genuinely equal collaboration. As Professor Richard Beadle showed in his 2015 Sanders lectures, Bradshaw can reasonably be regarded as one of the founding figures of manuscript studies. For all practical purposes, he invented the collational formula, the pseudo-algebraic shorthand which summarizes in letters and numbers the physical structure of a manuscript or early printed book. But I think we can take things further than that and think of Bradshaw as a pioneer in an area of activity which has become central to most great research libraries. The library as, for want of a better phrase, a research institute. It's fair to acknowledge that Bradshaw didn't get this quite right, devoting his time to his own scholarly interests while neglecting his duty of oversight of the library, and to an extent which would now be regarded as completely scandalous. But his legacy of the library as a place of collaborative scholarship is one which we continue to build on. We host interns and a research fellow, and we have embedded PhD students, as well as 2 embedded research units. We'd like to do still more, and we've recently recruited a research facilitator to help us develop in this area. Returning to Bradshaw, I suppose the question remains as to why I've chosen him as the third of my tipping points, and I think it's because his achievements can again helpfully be seen in a broader context. He was working at a time when other major British research libraries were noticeably active. In Cambridge, his lifetime coincided with the creation of new chairs and of the beginning of modern academic departments, many of them also with libraries embedded within them. But I think we can also look across the North Sea to the professionalization of scholarship in the great German universities of the 19th century, simultaneously an inspiration and a challenge. The Bradshaw era is a significant time for the development of one of the key features of the UL, an institution which is not only a place where readers undertake their own individual research, but which itself sponsors advanced research and which collaborates with others in and beyond Cambridge, and which builds and organizes and now digitizes collections to support that. And that leads me to one of our current projects, generously funded by the Polanski Foundation, and one which I don't doubt would have warmed Bradshaw's heart. The Polanski Greek Manuscript Project has not only pulled together a fantastically international cohort of cataloguers and conservators, but has been based around a deep partnership and growing friendship between Cambridge and the Great University Library in Heidelberg. Despite the challenges of recent months, that work has proceeded during the recent lockdown. In this backwards history, I've been trying to draw out how external forces and pressures impacted on the library and its evolution. I'm now leaping back more than 160 years from Bradshaw to early Georgian England and to 2 nearly contemporaneous events. They're not directly linked, but they happened at very nearly the same time, in 1715 and 1710. They resulted in the arrival of massive numbers of books. I will start with 1715. The gift of the so-called Royal Library by George I was one of the most transformative episodes in our history. My colleague Dr. Emily Duresh curated a brilliant exhibition to mark its 300th anniversary in 2015. The royal gift was designed, quite simply as a great big poke in the eye for the University of Oxford. I'm going to quote the traditional doggerel, which isn't terribly flattering to either university. King George, observing with judicious eyes the state of both his university ties, to Oxford sent a troop of horse, and why that learned body wanted loyalty. To Cambridge books he sent, as well discerning how much that loyal body wanted learning. In other words, this was a diplomatic gift, engineered by the Secretary of State, Viscount Townshend, to celebrate Cambridge's conspicuous loyalty to the new Hanoverian regime during the First Jacobite Rising. It comprised over 30,000 books and manuscripts, a collection which had once belonged to John Moore, Bishop of Ely. Perhaps the most spectacular private library assembled in England in the late 17th century, it was one of the finest, and perhaps the finest example, of a series of antiquarian bibliographical libraries assembled by the wealthy collectors of the era. I won't touch in detail on the printed books, though they include a superb array of Caxtons, but the manuscripts alone include the Moore Bede, the Moore Psalter, and the Book of Deer, alongside hundreds of others. It is a truly astonishing library. The royal gift, at a stroke, trebled the holdings of the UL and turned it into one of the greatest collections of its kind in Europe. 1710 was less spectacular, but had even greater implications than the Royal Library. The Copyright Act of 1710 copper-bottomed arrangements which had existed on and off since the 1660s. The UL became a legal deposit library. This sounds like great news. The 18th century library essentially did not have much by way of acquisitions budgets. It ran on donations, so its contents could be fairly haphazard. So free books were splendid, but the free books were not necessarily always the ones that the library and its readers wanted. And free books may be free, but they require processing and organising, and that is not free. So the library didn't enforce its privileges in a systematic way until Victorian times. But even so, millions of items have come in via legal deposit over the last 300 years. Today, printed legal deposit material is collected by the Legal Deposit Agency, a joint company based in Edinburgh, but working on behalf of Cambridge, the National Libraries of Wales and Scotland, the Bodleian, and the Library of Trinity College Dublin. Separate arrangements apply for electronic legal deposit, and it's interesting to note that an ever-increasing proportion of academic books coming in via legal deposit now arrive in electronic form. Frustratingly, the law requires that, unlike the e-books and the journals that we buy, they have to be read in our physical premises. Together, legal deposit and the Royal Library threatened to overwhelm the 18th century university library. We struggled to manage what had arrived, and we repeatedly ran out of space, resulting in the remodelling or attempted remodelling of parts of the old schools to accommodate all the books. But if we're talking about challenges leading to change, then the period from 1710 to 1715 is crucial. It kick-started a fundamental transformation. Cambridge moved from being a relatively modest Northern European university library into an institution which over time grew to such an extent that it eventually exceeded in scale and scope all but the very greatest European national libraries. It still does. When asked what he'd done in the French Revolution, one leading revolutionary is famously supposed to have remarked, "I survived." That is about the situation with the UL and the Reformation. Between the 1530s and the 1560s, the library at Cambridge was progressively damaged and depleted. No one attacked it or purged it. It was a matter of neglect and muddle arising from perceived irrelevance, of useless books discarded or thrown away, books stolen, and books borrowed and never returned. In 1529, when the Bishop of Durham, Cuthbert Tunstall, was giving us cutting-edge Greek texts, we had between 500 and 600 books. But by 1547, a grace had authorised the abandonment of the original Bibliotheca Communis, the 15th century common library, because no one was any longer using it. A decade later, there were just 175 books left. One of Tunstall's Greek manuscripts is now in the Vatican. Another is at Trinity. But survive, the library did. And that didn't happen in Oxford, where the medieval university library went under completely. It simply ceased to exist, and its book lecterns were sold to Christ Church in 1562 because there were no books left to put on them. But because the library at Cambridge survived, there was something to be built on and built up and revived, something which happened in the 1570s and 1580s, and that's my next turning point. The crucial date is 1574. The driving figure was Andrew Perne, Master of Peterhouse, who successfully marshalled a coalition of wealthy supporters, which included the Archbishop of Canterbury, Matthew Parker, the Bishops of Winchester and Durham, and the Lord Keeper, Sir Nicholas Bacon, to revive the library. The books they gave were a mixture of contemporary scholarship and ancient manuscripts, many clearly relevant to Parker's mission to demonstrate the antiquity and authenticity of the Reformed Church of England. Most of Parker's books, of course, went to Corpus, not the university, but the UL donations included many printed books, for example, a Plantin Polyglot Bible, a Nuremberg Chronicle, and a lot of Reformed theology. They also included 36 Anglo-Saxon manuscripts. The books given by Lord Keeper Bacon were marked by what was thought until very recently to be the first English bookplate. Nearly all were printed, but the one manuscript was the extremely beautiful 11th century Winchcombe Psalter, probably actually from Ramsey in the Fens, which Parker had given to Bacon and Bacon gave to the library. Many of these books were listed in John Key's Historia Cantabrigiae Academiae Liber Primus of 1574, and that means, I think, that we can claim to be the first library in Europe to have its books listed in print. By then, about 3/5 of our 435 books were new arrivals, and 2/5 were survivors from before the Reformation. Libraries need maintenance and money as well as books, and that was seen to as well. An odd job man called Dowson was put to work patching up the furniture in Archbishop Rotherham's library, a 15th century Gothic building on the east front of the schools. A new catalogue was compiled in 1583, when the books were set out on 16 lecterns. Libraries also need librarians, and a library keeper was appointed in 1577. The university seems to have had trouble paying the annual salary, £3, 3 shillings and 6pence, and this led to a set of ordinances for the library issued in 1582, clearly pushed forward, not just to control future librarians, but to make sure the university was kept on its toes. By then, we not only had books, but globes, astrolabes, and instruments mathematical. When Perne died in 1589, he bequeathed 40 shillings a year toward the stipend of a learned scholar that shall be appointed for the safekeeping of the books of the university library. Gifts and a general sense of things being in good order, of course, attract more gifts. And what is still perhaps our most famous manuscript, the 5th century Codex Bezae, arrived in 1582, the gift of the Genevan reformer Théodore de Bèze. By 1586, we were doing so well for gifts and benefactions that we reclaimed the common library room abandoned 40 years earlier. And in the following century, the technological revolution of installing shelving to replace lecterns enabled the space allocated to the library to keep pace with its ever-growing contents. The collection grew spectacularly right through the 17th century, reaching about 16,000 books by 1715. I mentioned earlier that the other English medieval university library folded up during the Reformation. Our colleagues in Oxford have always made a great deal of Sir Thomas Bodley, who refounded them in 1604. For whatever reason, Cambridge has in modern times made rather a lot less of what happened here 30 years earlier. I think perhaps it's a story we should celebrate more often. We will end with the beginning. We don't have time to explore the history of the library in the Middle Ages in any detail, but there was probably a university library of sorts in the second half of the 14th century, with the books housed in chests. Some of them may have found their way there as collateral for loans. The first documentary evidence is from 1416, and the first catalogue, which we still have, dates from 1424 and lists 122 volumes arranged in 9 subject divisions. The next catalogue is from 1473, by which time there were 330 books chained on lecterns. There were also buildings. The common library, the Bibliotheca Communis of the university, was constructed on the west side of the old schools at some time between 1420 and 1438. By the end of the 15th century, the buildings had expanded considerably, notably with the construction of the Nova Bibliotheca, funded by the library's first really major benefactor, Archbishop Thomas Rotherham of York, in the 1470s. This survived until 1756, and the front door you can still see today in the park at Madingley. So in the space of just over half a century, the library had developed from something quite informal, a few books in a box, to something starting to resemble an institution, with benefactors, books in manuscript and print, readily consultable by scholars, and fine buildings, the whole supervised by a chaplain who clearly fulfilled many of the responsibilities of a librarian. This, more than the events of the 1570s, the Royal Library, Bradshaw, Giles Gilbert Scott, and the shift to digital, this was surely the greatest turning point of all. We came into being, and we're still here.